While a huge water wheel powered a blast of air to the furnace, the operation in the casting house was strictly manual. A movable bench is pushed along over a pile of sand. The mold begins with a piece of wood called a follow board. An intricately carved wooden pattern, the exact size and shape of the piece being cast, is placed on the follow board. The bottom half of the box-like device which will contain the mold is next set in place. The box is called the flask, and the bottom part of the flask is called the drag. A fine layer of charcoal is dusted over the pattern so that the moistened sand used to make the mold will not stick to the pattern. The first shovelful of sand is sifted through a device called a riddle. The fine screen assures a smooth, even coating of sand over the pattern, picking up all the fine detail carved into the pattern. The drag is then filled to overflowing with additional sand. The sand used for mold making is finely textured and has a natural clay binder. Often called Albany sand because of the location in which it was found in abundance, the mold sand is kept moist so that it will copy and retain the shapes carved into the patterns. Using a rammer, the molder compacts the sand into the mold. It takes considerable strength to pack the loose sand tightly around the pattern. Hopewell stoves were molded in pieces and the plates shipped to distant dealers for assembly and sale. Each molder was paid only for the perfect pieces he cast. Naturally, with this in mind, a molder took great care to see that the compacting of sand, particularly on the design side of the stove plate, was done properly. Scraping away the excess sand, the molder places another follow board on top and turns the whole mold over. It took muscle as well as skill to be a molder, since the molds, when filled with compacted, moist sand, were quite heavy. A trough around the edge of the mold was shaped with a molder's spoon. This ensured a firm fit between the mold halves and prevented the molten iron from leaking out between the two parts of the mold. A puff or two of air to clean the mold of loose sand particles, and the molder was ready to make the top half. The cope, or top half of the flask, is fitted into place. Another dusting of charcoal will keep the mold halves from sticking together. The process was repeated. The first contact layer of sand is sifted through the riddle, and the flask filled to overflowing with loose sand. A wooden wedge was inserted into the second half of the mold in order to form the gate. This is the hole through which the molten metal was poured. The iron which filled this hole was called gate metal. It was broken from the cast stove plate and sold as scrap to a forge. The nearby forges heated the iron scraps and hammered them into the bar iron used by blacksmiths. Because southeastern Pennsylvania was rich in iron ore, the entire area was dotted with furnaces and forges. Removing the gate wedge was tricky. The molder was careful not to loosen any sand, which might fall into the mold and ruin the design. The top layer of a well-made mold slopes toward the gate so that the drainage assures an even flow of the molten iron. The gate is cleaned with the long end of the molder's spoon. Again, the object is to remove any stray particles of sand which might cause an imperfect cast. Up to 16 molders worked in the casting house during Hopewell's peak period. Each worked a 12-hour day and made and cast up to a dozen molds. The most delicate operation of all came next. The pattern was carefully removed so as not to disturb the sand mold. A perfect mold holds every ridge, every curlicue, every shape of the original pattern in the moist sand. For this demonstration, an aluminum pattern is used. But in Hopewell's time, original hand-carved wooden patterns were used. These were quite expensive and were often supplied to furnaces such as Hopewell by individual stove dealers in the cities. Thus, many of the patterns not only contained exclusive designs, but many proudly displayed the firm's name, not of Hopewell, but of the dealer who supplied the pattern. The mold is reassembled. In Hopewell's time, the furnace was tapped late in the day, and the molder ladled molten metal into the mold. The result was a perfect replica in metal of the stove piece. A good molder could earn in excess of $200 a year, but he was credited on the company books with only his perfect pieces.